It's 5:05 and welcome into a Tuesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. Well, late last week, Representative Tim Moore, he's the Republican out of the North Carolina 14th Congressional District, led the North Carolina congressional delegation in sending a bipartisan letter to the Internal Revenue Service urging them to further extend the tax filing deadline for victims of Hurricane Helene. Moore told Carolina Journal last week, quote, "Victims of Hurricane Helene in my district and across western North Carolina are still rebuilding and recovering. I recently visited Lake Lure and Chimney Rock, and while there's been real progress, the road to full recovery is far from over. The last thing on these folks' minds right now is filing their taxes. We need to give them the time and the flexibility they need, and extending this deadline is a common sense step to support families and small businesses as they get back on their feet." The letter requests that the deadline for Helene victims be extended from where it is right now, May the 1st, to September the 25th. Currently, the tax day, of course, heading 1 week from today, April the 15th. It was already extended to May 1. It is now being asked to be extended to September the 25th. The letter reads in part, quote, "While the hurricane occurred months ago, businesses are still grappling with billions of dollars in damages. Many of these businesses suffered total losses and did not have adequate insurance coverage, as Western North Carolina does not routinely see natural disasters as damaging as Hurricane Helene. In addition to the unprecedented damage caused by the hurricane, various grants, loans, and other forms of relief were delayed, leaving many businesses and individuals waiting months to receive appropriate disaster assistance." It continues by saying, due to the combination of these factors, we believe it is appropriate for the IRS to further extend the filing deadline for Hurricane Helene victims. Not doing so will only burden individuals and businesses who are grappling with one of the worst natural disasters in North Carolina history. Thank you for your attention to this matter. It was signed by both Senators Tom Tillis and Ted Budd and the entire delegation out of the North Carolina Congress, both Democrats and Republicans alike. That letter has been sent to the IRS. We await their response, and we'll track the details and pass them along as soon as we get them right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 5:08, News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. The state's highest court, the North Carolina Supreme Court, has pressed pause on the election dispute between Democrat Allison Riggs and Republican Jefferson Griffin. To get those latest details this morning, Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation joins us once again on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Mitch, we chatted yesterday morning. You walked us through the decision from the appeals court on Friday, and here we are walking into Tuesday morning. Some more decisions now from the state's highest court. What are you learning?
Yeah, it's not terribly surprising that after that ruling came out on Friday that basically went along to some extent with what Jefferson Griffin is asking for in challenging more than 65,000 ballots, that both the State Board of Elections and the Democratic candidate Allison Riggs aren't happy with what the appeals court called for, and so asked the state Supreme Court to step back in. Now, they're asking for several different things. First, they asked in court filings that were officially filed on Sunday and appeared on the state court system's website on Monday morning. They asked for a temporary stay to be issued at some point during the day on Monday, because if it was not issued on Monday, then the case would go from the Court of Appeals back to a trial judge and then back pretty quickly to the State Board of Elections to go through this whole process of trying to get people to say whether they have their completed voter information, and if so, their votes would count, and if not, their votes would not count. Also, the same thing for overseas voters who didn't have photo ID. They'd be asked for the photo ID. If they didn't provide the ID, their votes would get thrown out. The State Board of Elections and Allison Riggs did not want that process to start without the state Supreme Court having a chance to review this whole issue. So they asked for a temporary stay. They're also asking for an order called a writ of supersedes that would overrule the State Court of Appeals order in this case. And then they're also asking for the Supreme Court to take up the entire dispute and review the whole case itself. Now, the only ruling that came out on Monday was that the state Supreme Court, in a pair of orders responding to both the state board and to Allison Riggs, said yes to the temporary stay. That's not surprising because although the state board and Allison Riggs were the ones who asked for it, Jefferson Griffin did not object. So no one really had a problem with the temporary stay in this case. The next big issue, though, will be this order called the writ of supersedes and whether the state Supreme Court will issue that, which would block the Court of Appeals order, and presumably it would block the order while the state Supreme Court decides what to do with the case. If the state Supreme Court decides no on a writ of supersedes, it probably means that they want the Court of Appeals to go ahead with its order, which, as we have talked about, would lead to thousands of voters scrambling either to show that their voter registration information is complete or provide the information to make it complete, or if they're overseas voters, to confirm that they have a photo ID so their votes would count. This is something that, of course, would involve a lot of time, a lot of effort. We know the parties and the candidates would all get involved to make sure that the voters that they support get their information in. But none of that will happen for a while because the state Supreme Court has decided, as you said at the top, to press pause, put in this temporary stay until it decides what to do on these other orders and requests from the state board and Allison Riggs.
Mitch, as you just kind of walk down the timeline on all of this, this is a very quick turnaround. I mean, here we are Tuesday morning. You could have people that would have, as the clock starts, a 15 business day window to confirm either the last four of their social security number or driver's license number or a photo ID, depending on the exact situation that they were in. Do you think that's part of the reason that the court issued this temporary stay as quickly as they did, and maybe why Justice Griffin didn't oppose? This would have, I mean, talk about panic and chaos. It seemed like some of that would have ensued very quickly with some 65,000 plus voters.
Yes, and there are two main reasons why the stay came down as quickly as it did. One is that in the State Court of Appeals order, the mandate in the case, which is the order comes out, and then the mandate is what officially sends the case from one court to another. In the court order itself on Friday, the mandate of the case, which normally would be a couple of weeks, was set to be the end of the business day on Monday. So if nothing else had happened from any court, the case would have moved from the Court of Appeals back to a trial court for that whole process to start fairly quickly. So that's reason number one. Reason number two is that in the request for a temporary stay, both the State Board of Elections and Allison Riggs, in two separate court filings, both asked for a decision by 5 o'clock on Monday. So they were basically saying, look, the mandate of this case is 5 o'clock Monday. Please issue a decision by 5 p.m. on Monday. And so the state Supreme Court did. And thankfully to those of us who were hoping to leave at 5 o'clock, it didn't come down at 5 o'clock. It was actually in the 3 o'clock hour. But that's the main reason why something so quickly is happening in this case. But also remember that the state Supreme Court, as it has dealt with this issue a couple of times before, has ordered other courts to act expeditiously. So
Sure.
It would be tough for them to say, well, you act expeditiously and then wait 2 or 3 days or weeks or more before making its own decision.
Well, that was going to be my next question for you. This is a temporary stay. Is there any idea as to what this temporary stay timeline looks like?
You know, it's not certain. Usually temporary stays don't last for more than a couple of weeks. So my guess is we haven't seen any timeline on when the paperwork is due on responding to the request for the writ of supersedes. If Jefferson Griffin is against it, which I assume that he would be, unless he doesn't really like the way the Court of Appeals is spelling out its process, if he has a response to that writ, that probably has to come down in a couple of days. Then the state Supreme Court would decide whether to issue the writ. If it issues the writ, then the temporary stay goes because the writ would accomplish the same goal. And then you would see the whole process play out of when the briefing would take place and maybe an oral argument for this case before the state Supreme Court. So we're a ways away from getting this thing resolved. Even if the Court of Appeals order had been able to go forward without any objection from the state Supreme Court, you would have been a couple of weeks away from resolution of all of those ballots and whether they would count or not. But still, that process now has been put on hold as the state Supreme Court steps into this case and probably has at least a couple of weeks, if not several weeks or more, to resolve what the state Supreme Court's going to do.
Mitch, thanks for walking us through those new details this morning. Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:15, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time to get a look at traffic on your Tuesday morning. A look at the roadways with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
We're headed back to Heist Brewery and Barrel Arts on Wednesday, April the 16th from 7 to 9 p.m. for WBT's News and Brews, and we, of course, would love to see you there. All of your WBT friends will be in attendance to raise a glass with you and talk about the news of the day. It's WBT's News and Brews headed your way Wednesday, April the 16th at Heist Brewery and Barrel Arts. Visit WBT.com this morning for tickets and event details. 521, welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. I've got a pretty bizarre story for you this morning. 31-year-old Mateen Mohammed Alagani of Raleigh recently pled guilty to charges of importing thousands of counterfeit car steering wheel airbags into the Triangle area over the past 2 years. He was also an engineer for the North Carolina Department of Transportation. Homeland Security investigations led the overall investigation there, along with the U.S. Department of Transportation and the Office of the Inspector General. Court documents show that Allegheny imported more than 2,500 counterfeit airbags between May 2022 and April of 2024 that had counterfeit markings of Honda, Chevrolet, General Motors, and Toyota. The case is outlined in a press release from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of North Carolina and the Department of Homeland Security. It was discussed at a recent Council of State meeting with North Carolina's Secretary of State Elaine Marshall, telling her fellow council members at the meeting that her office's Trademark Enforcement Division, or Anti-Counterfeit Task Force, assisted in the case as well. Marshall said during the Council of State meeting, quote, "We work with a lot of legitimate manufacturers, and they have private investigators. So our contacts with General Motors and Honda led us to locate this person in northern Wake County, where we found a large number of counterfeit products. And I think this was more like a distribution center for the East Coast. Always in these counterfeit cases, you go back to the source of the chain you're interested in, where the money is going, because sometimes it is involved in organized crime, terrorism, or what have you. Those are the kinds of leads that the feds follow because we simply don't have the ability to do that." The source was traced back to London, and a person with Marshall's staff traveled there to assist the City of London's Intellectual Property Crime Unit with the search of 2 residences and businesses where they seized over 500 of those counterfeit airbags and significant amounts of cash. Marshall said, quote, "Selling counterfeit airbags has a tremendously serious and dangerous consequences if they don't employ at all for the safety factors that they were intended to have. If those counterfeits deployed with toxic goods or shrapnel-like things, then it is also a huge safety and health risk." So this is an example of a strong partnership of both federal, state, local, and now international law enforcement that have worked together to take a very, very serious product off of the market and indirect things that could potentially save lives. So we're just very pleased with that, and it recognized that. According to the Office of the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District, vehicle owners who are suspected that they purchased a counterfeit airbag should consult their brand dealership to determine if the parts needed to be replaced, or if parts need to be replaced rather, and report it to their local Homeland Security Investigation Office, or submit a complaint online with the National Intellectual Property Rights Coordination Center or the National Traffic and Safety Administration. Marshall also reminded members that due to the failing business renewals that is April the 15th, last year the state had more than 715,000 annual renewals compared to 458,000 in 2019. So just tagging that onto the end there. Counterfeit airbags, a very interesting story. You can read additional details and see some pictures of these devices that were released by the office out of the Eastern District of North Carolina. You can see those details this morning over on our website, carolinajournal.com, where it's now 5:25. As we continue to go through spring and into the summer months, weather will be on a lot of folks' minds across the state of North Carolina. There's an interesting piece of legislation that's working its way through the General Assembly dealing with what is called a radar coverage gap that exists here in North Carolina. To get some additional details on that, Katie Zehnder, CarolinaJournal.com, joins us this morning on the News Hour. Katie, this is a pretty big story for a very large metropolitan area across our state.
Hi, good morning, Nick. Yeah, so last week, U.S. Representative Tim Moore, who represents the 14th Congressional District of North Carolina and was up until recently the Speaker of the House in the North Carolina General Assembly, up until the end of the last session. But he introduced a bill in Congress called the Radar Gap Elimination Act. And this really emphasizes closing the radar gap in high risk areas, especially high metropolitan areas, such as Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlotte is one of the high risk areas from the radar gap that the National Weather Service uses. And so the Radar Gap Elimination Act, known as H.R. 2646, authorizes the nationwide replacement of radar systems that use the next generation radar, known as NEXRAD, and updates the radar coverage nationwide.
Yeah, this story about this coverage gap is something that weather enthusiasts and meteorologists have been yelling about for quite some time. There is a small radar in the Charlotte area over at the airport, but that's what they call a terminal radar, Doppler radar. It is not anywhere near as strong as the ones from the National Weather Service, which, Katie, from what I understand, the closest one is all the way down in Greenville, South Carolina, some 90 plus miles from the Charlotte metro. That's a huge gap that we're talking about.
Right. And so one of the things that this bill would do is it would direct the National Weather Service to create a deployment strategy and focus on densely populated areas such as Charlotte that are more than 75 miles from a NEXRAD station, and install a phased array radar station, or a PAR as they are known. And so, these densely populated areas that are at high risk, that are more than 75 miles from a NEXRAD station, they really do need something, like a deployment system or a PAR station to, kind of protect them from this radar gap and, update the current systems that they're using.
Now, Katie, it's not often that we get to necessarily talk about bipartisan issues. A lot of things that we talk about are right or left political issues. I can presume something like this. Obviously, federal funding is a major discussion right now, and there could be some kinks with that. But in regards to a story like this, I can imagine there'd be pretty broad bipartisan support trying to keep a major metropolitan area safe during severe weather season.
Right. So this is a bipartisan sponsored bill. It is co-sponsored by Pat Harrigan, who represents North Carolina 10th Congressional District, and Deborah Ross, who represents the 2nd Congressional District of North Carolina. So those are the three primary sponsors on the bill. And then, of course, there's going to be, your secondary sponsors, but it is a bipartisan sponsored bill. And Moore said that what really brought this kind of issue to light was the devastation of Hurricane Helene. He said, quote, "The devastation of Hurricane Helene showed us how important it is that accurate weather data is to saving lives and hardening communities to minimize damage from upcoming storms and natural disasters." And then he goes on to talk about that more. But, Charlotte is one of the most densely populated areas, and really needs that protection. And so that was one of the things, this is, I guess you could say, one of the good things that has come out of Hurricane Helene is, highlighting kind of gaps like this so that we can address them and better protect the people of North Carolina from future, disasters like future hurricanes and tropical storms and weather events like this, so that they can be better prepared to protect themselves.
Now, obviously, this morning we are talking about the Charlotte metro area as it relates to our listeners here on WBT and those across the state. But from my understanding on this legislation, Katie, there's a couple of about half a dozen or so other major metropolitan cities across the United States that might fall into this as well. So presumably Congress is going to have to move forward with some significant funding. Those phased array radars that you're talking about are very, very expensive to deploy and roll out. So some significant money would have to be allocated for this project.
Exactly, Nick. So, yeah, obviously Charlotte is a very important area to Representative Moore, being, from North Carolina, and him being the primary sponsor on the legislation. But, this is a federal congressional bill, so it's not just going to affect North Carolina. If it does become law, it's going to affect, several, metropolitan, heavily densely populated areas that are at risk, similar to Charlotte across the nation. And these are very expensive, systems to deploy and to install. So, yeah, there's going to be some federal funding, assuming this is signed into law and enacted as it works its way through Congress.
Katie, you've got some additional details this morning, including some pictures of the current radar sites and some additional details on that. Where do folks go and get those this morning?
Right. They can read the full story along with all the details and quotes from lawmakers at carolinajournal.com.
Katie Zehnder joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:31, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time for another look at traffic this morning with the great Boomer Von Cannon.
Thank you, Dick. hot.
538, you're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Taking a look at some statewide news this morning. There was a small but notable improvement in teacher attrition rates within public schools districts during the 23-24 academic year. This is according to a new report from the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, DPI there. Their latest State of the Teacher Profession report, which was presented to the State Board of Education last week, shows that teacher attrition rates fell to 9.88%. That's down from 11.5% the prior year, and this represents a loss of nearly 1,500 fewer teachers compared to the year before that left various teaching professions across the state, though the rate remains high with a 7-year average of 8.64% overall. According to Superintendent Mo Green, he said, quote, "While the report shows improvement in the percentage of teachers staying compared to the previous years, this is still far too many teachers leaving the profession. We need to do a much better job of keeping them in the classroom once they're hired. That starts with reverting the professionalism for the amazing job that they do and providing them with great salaries and opportunities for growth within our public schools." The report tracks teacher attrition and vacancy rates across the state's 115 public school districts from March of 2023 to March of 2024. Teacher attrition measures the proportion of educators departing their roles in public schools, whether they leave for non-teaching positions within the system or leave public education altogether. Certain groups of teachers are more likely to leave than others, according to the report. However, newer teachers with 0 to 5 years of service left at rates ranging from 11.7% to a whopping 17.5%, while veteran educators nearing retirement with 28 years of experience had even higher attrition rates between 18.5% and 26.8%, nearly 1 in 4 there. The numbers of new teachers entering North Carolina classrooms through alternative licensure routes, such as emergency or residency licenses, has also seen a decline since last year, but still makes up nearly 50% of new hires. Data from the report indicates that of the more than 3,600 teachers issued permits to teach in the 2018-2019 school year, only 61% of those converted those permits into residency licenses by the 23-24 school year. Similarly, just 55% of teachers with emergency licenses from the same period secured long-term licenses in the state. Dr. Tom Toberlin of North Carolina's Department of Public Instruction, the senior director there, said, quote, "The middling conversion rates show that we still have work to do when it comes to supporting our alternative prepared teachers. While the attrition rate has declined, the vacancy rate has ticked upwards. For the 23-24 school year, the vacancy rate was 8.2%, but this figure includes positions filled with temporary licensed educators or retired teachers who have decided to return to the classroom. The unfilled teacher positions, if calculated separately, would result in a much lower vacancy rate of just 1.9%. Toberlin noted that while the expanded definition of vacancy helps legislators understand the gap between current staffing situations and ideal staffing situations, the headline number often obscures the efforts schools make to ensure classrooms are filled. He said in a press release, quote, "Our school and district leaders do a great job of trying to make sure that all students' needs are met with staff members and resources that are available." This year's report also introduced new data on principal turnover. Following a legislative request, the findings show that the principal attrition rates are much lower than that of teachers, with 92.4% of principals remaining in their roles from March of 23 to March of 24. But at the end of the 22-23 school year, 186 principals out of a total of 2,400 left public school employment, representing an attrition rate of about 7 3/4 50%. A majority of those who left, roughly 65%, retired from public education all around. A lot of numbers, a lot of data this morning. You can get those additional details by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. The headline, NC teacher turnover rate ticks down, but still exceeds historic averages. It's now 5:43. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Tax day is quickly approaching next week, April the 15th. That, of course, is raising some questions for folks out in western North Carolina that were so heavily devastated from Hurricane Helene, which affected our state back in September of last year. There's already been a brief extension for them. Some new calls from Congress this morning to extend that date even further. To get some details on that this morning, Katie Zehnder from CarolinaJournal.com joins us on the News Hour. Katie, I can imagine folks out in the western half of the state that are still working on rebuilding their homes, their businesses, their farms. Tax day is probably one of the last things on their mind. What does this new letter out of Congress look like?
Right, exactly, Nick. So, yeah, last Thursday, U.S. Representative Tim Moore, who represents the 14th Congressional District of North Carolina, and most recently served as the Speaker of the House in the North Carolina General Assembly. But he led the North Carolina congressional delegation in sending a letter to the IRS to Acting Commissioner Melanie Krause. And basically what this letter does is urges the IRS to extend the tax deadline for Helene victims specifically from May 1st to September 25th. So that would give them an additional, 4 months, I believe, to file their taxes. These people out in Western North Carolina are still just trying to get their lives back together. So filing their taxes are the last thing on their mind right now. And that's pretty much exactly what Representative Moore told me. He said, victims of Hurricane Helene in my district and across Western North Carolina are still rebuilding and recovering. I recently visited Lake Lure and Chimney Rock, and while there's been real progress, the road to recovery is far from over. And then I also was able to speak with Representative Pat Harrigan, who represents the 10th Congressional District. And he said, Hurricane Helene devastated communities across Western North Carolina, and many families are still fighting to recover. For those who lost everything but a few extra months to file taxes is not a luxury. It is a necessary step to ease the burden and give them room to rebuild. So this letter is a bipartisan letter. It is basically signed by the entire North Carolina, congressional delegation, not just Republicans. It's signed by Don Davis, Deborah Ross, Alma Adams, Valerie Fauci, in addition to, Representative Moore, Virginia Fox, David Rouser, Richard Hudson, pretty much the entire North Carolina delegation is urging the IRS to give these victims of Helene an extra 4 months to file their taxes because there's just the last thing on their minds right now.
And I guess this is not necessarily something brand new. That when there's been major natural disasters in the past, most of the time it's something like a hurricane or major wildfire. We've seen some of these extensions given before as well. Katie, from your understanding, is this something that the head of as you noted, the acting head of the IRS, is this something they can do themselves, or is there a congressional approval on this? Do you know anything about that process?
I don't have a ton of details on that process, no. So, yes, I believe that it is something that can be, enacted by by the acting commissioner themselves. I don't believe that there is a congressional process or confirmation that they have to go through. So, so hopefully that this will move forward pretty quickly, and the victims will be able to get that extra time to file their taxes.
Now, this is obviously, we're talking about the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service at the federal level. State taxes are still due in many cases, coming up April the 15th next week as well. Has there been any discussion? Has that date moved for state filings, or is the same thing as it stands right now?
To my knowledge, that is the same thing as it stands right now. As far as I know, there hasn't been any extensions or requests for extensions for those filings.
Katie, where can folks get some additional details, including reading a full copy of the letter that we're talking about this morning?
Right. They can read the full letter along with all the quotes from lawmakers and all the details at CarolinaJournal.com.
Katie Zehnder joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:47, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Another look at traffic this Tuesday morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
Good morning again. It's 5:54. Welcome to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Recapping one of our big stories this morning. The North Carolina Supreme Court has issued a stay in the legal dispute over the 2024 state Supreme Court election results, pausing a lower court ruling that would have led to a partial vote recount. The case involves Republican candidate Judge Jefferson Griffin, who currently trails Democrat incumbent Justice Allison Riggs by 734 votes. Griffin challenged over 65,000 ballots, mainly targeting voters with incomplete registration data, overseas voters lacking photo ID, and individuals who have never lived in North Carolina. A 2-1 appeals court ruling ordered to the State Board of Elections to begin a complex curing process, which would have allowed voters around 15 days to correct registration issues, was ordered by the appeals court on Friday. Judges John Tyson and Fred Gore supported the ruling, while Judge Tobias Hampson, the Democrat on the appeals court, dissented, arguing that all challenged voters followed existing rules and were not proven ineligible. Riggs and the State Board of Elections quickly appealed, calling the ruling unprecedented, unlawful, and disenfranchising. Both filed petitions for a writ of supersedence, which would halt the impending would essentially halt the appeals court decision as it stands right now. However, the state's highest court, the Supreme Court, granted a stay with Justice Trey Allen signing the order, Riggs obviously recusing herself from the decision. The case now awaits further review from the state's highest court. With Riggs recused, Republicans hold a 5-1 majority. A potential 3-3 split among the remaining justices could allow the appeal court ruling to stand, potentially altering the outcome of the election months after the fact. This, of course, has been a major political story that we have been tracking for months now, going back to the November election of last year. The big decision from the appeals court on Friday. Yesterday around 3 o'clock, the state Supreme Court issued that temporary stay. As we chatted earlier this morning with Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation, it's not immediately clear how long that stay will be in effect. It could be as long as a couple of weeks before the state's highest court decides whether they are going to take up this full appeal from Democrat Allison Riggs and the State Board of Elections or not. Again, we will continue to track and wait for some of those details to come forward. You can read them over on our website, carolinajournal.com, and of course, we'll bring you up to date here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Another busy day expected in the North Carolina General Assembly today. Dozens of committee meetings taking place in both the House and the Senate. We'll be tracking all of those throughout the day, and we'll have those latest details coming up for you tomorrow as well. Well, that's going to do it for a Tuesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back with you tomorrow morning, 5 to 6, right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.